One of the things we often hear is that there's no point in studying Latin because it's a dead language that no one speaks. And while there are some enthusiasts out there who speak Latin, and while I think in the Vatican in Rome there's communication in Latin, it's obviously true that all but in a few very specific environments you're not going to be speaking Latin. But it's not true that Latin is dead. If we speak English, which obviously that's the language we're communicating in now, we're using Latin all the time. For example, a second ago I used the word communicating. That comes from Latin. There are a lot of advantages to studying Latin. And one of the key advantages of studying Latin is that it forces you to pay attention to grammar. I know this from personal experience. I taught myself to read French beginning at the age of 19. I taught myself to read French. And, I used books like, French in 10 Minutes a Day and other books like that. I also used the French Bible, or the Bible in French translation, and just kind of went through it, looking up words I didn't know one at a time, and eventually I learned the words. And when it came to like verbs, verb tenses, past tense, future tense, I just kind of figured it out, right? But I never learned the grammar. One result of not learning the grammar of French as I was teaching myself to read the language is that when I went to Quebec in Canada a number of times and even lived in Quebec for 2 years, even though I could read French easily, I could read French newspapers easily, I used a lot of French sources in my studies, I was never a confident speaker of French because I didn't know the rules. Now, of course, you can grow up with a language and speak it perfectly well without knowing the rules, but that's not where I was. I had learned the language as a young adult. I didn't know the rules. I was not immersed in French, and therefore I just didn't really know exactly how the language worked in spoken form because I didn't know the rules. Now, the reason behind that is that coming into early adulthood, I did not know English grammar. I spoke English well, I wrote English well, but I had never been asked to learn grammar. Consequently, when I learned my first language, I really didn't even know what grammar was. So, yes, I taught myself to learn French, but I didn't know grammar. I did that with the second language, and then when it came to Latin, I thought, oh, I'll do the same thing. I'll just teach myself Latin the same way I taught myself those other two languages. But what I quickly realized is that with Latin, that's not possible. With Latin, you have to learn the grammar. And one of the reasons for this is that in Latin, word order isn't really important. In French, word order is important. In English, word order is important. In other languages I've studied, word order is important. In Latin, word order is not very important. What is very important is the grammar. And if you want to put a sentence together, you've got to understand the grammar. So Latin forced me to learn grammar. So it's very interesting is that I learned English grammar in the process of learning to read the New Testament in Latin. So I'm very glad that I studied Latin for that reason. Now, of course, students who do know English grammar, of course, will have an easier time going at Latin because they know what grammar is and they have that advantage, although English and Latin grammar are different. Something else that's very valuable in the study of Latin is that it forces you to pay attention to detail. Very small changes in words can have significant differences of meaning. And this is a great thing for young students, especially the way I put it, students who are too young to fight back, right? Students who are learning, who don't mind learning little details that might drive a 16, 17, 18-year-old crazy. Those kinds of details can be fun for younger students who are 7, 8, 9 years old. So Latin is very important because it forces you to learn grammar and it forces you to pay attention to detail. And then a really, excellent reason to study Latin is that you learn in the process of learning to read Latin, you learn the origins of hundreds and hundreds of words in English. And then if you know Spanish or French or some other some other Latin language, those languages are basically dialects of Latin. And so once you have a pretty good Latin vocabulary, then learning Spanish is all the easier, learning French is all the easier. No, it goes in the opposite way as well. And Benjamin Franklin, his thought was, look, let's teach the kids a living language first, like French or Spanish, and then Latin will be easier, and that makes sense. It can go either way. But whether you learn Latin first and then Spanish, or Spanish first and then Latin, they complement each other, and you see in Spanish, all of the Latin that's there. The same is true of English. Even though English is not a Latin language, English is a Germanic language, but there's so much Latin that's in English. So while you're learning Latin, you're learning the origins of a lot of English words. The reason why I advocate using the New Testament, and especially the Gospels, for learning Latin, one reason is that the Latin of the Gospels is fairly easy Latin. And I'm not an expert in Latin. I'm not an expert in Latin. I can read the Gospels in Latin, and that's fairly straightforward, fairly easy Latin. The verb tenses are pretty straightforward. So if we don't have an intention to become, to acquire expertise in Latin, if we just want to have a good familiarity with Latin, I think that's a great goal, to say, well, look, I want my Latin to be good enough so that I can read the Gospels in Latin. One advantage of this is that if you're familiar with the Gospels already, then it makes learning the Latin a little bit easier, because you know the stories, you know where the story's going, you know what the vocabulary should be, and so it's easier just to work things out. The text is already familiar. Another thing is that if you're in the habit of reading the Gospels regularly, then this is a way to make Latin part of your life. One of the things that might come with learning Latin from reading Cicero, from reading Julius Caesar, from reading some other ancient author, is, and that's all perfectly great, but it's unlikely that you're going to incorporate that stuff into your daily life. But if you are a regular reader of the Gospels, that's something that you can incorporate into your daily life. You could incorporate a verse from the Gospels in Latin into your daily life. If you go to church, you can bring your Latin Bible with you and read along as people are reading in English, as they're reading in Spanish, whatever language they're reading in. You can have your Latin Bible and read along. It can actually become part of your daily life. That's why I advocate going in Latin, using the Gospels as a basic text. I just wanted to show you something that gets at some of a little bit of the usefulness of Latin. And that's really, the argument that I'm making, that studying Latin is tremendously useful. Now at the very top you see we have John chapter 1 verse 1 in English. And this is an unusual English sentence in that there is, so far as I can see, just one Latin word in it, and it's the very first one, in. And actually that goes back even to Greek, right? Aside from that, all of the other words that we see in John 1:1 in that translation are Germanic. And English is a Germanic language. So this is an unusual sentence in that there's just that one bit of Latin at the very beginning, in, although as I said, that actually originates with the Greeks and then it's picked up by the Romans. Let's look at John 1:1 in Latin. In principio, you'll hear different pronunciations of these words, so this is just the pronunciation I use. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now let's look at the French. Au commencement était la parole, et la parole était avec Dieu, et la parole était Dieu. Now, French speakers out there will have heard my horrible accent. What I want you to notice is that, look for example, in the Latin, Deum, Deus, those are both words for God. Then look at the French, Dieu. That's just one example. There are other things we could point out, but now let's go down to Spanish. En el principio ya existía el verbo estaba con Dios, y el verbo era Dios. Look at Dios, Deum, Deus, Dieu, Dios, right? Also notice in the Latin we have verbum. In the Spanish we have verbo, right? In the French we have parole, la parole, the word. In English we use that word. A person is on parole. That is, he's on, basically he's given his word that he's not going to commit other crimes or he's not going to run away. Also notice in the French commencement, in the beginning, we have the English word commence. There's a common tie to Latin because that word originates in Latin. Notice in the Latin you have in principio, and then in Spanish you have en el principio, right? Obviously very much related, okay? Because Spanish is a dialect of Latin, basically. French is a dialect of Latin. Now, so English is a Germanic language, then we have Latin, then we have French and Spanish, both Latin languages. The bottom language is John 1:1 in Welsh, language spoken in Britain, and it's a Celtic language. Notice that the very first word, that's in, right? Latin, going back even to the Greeks. Anna da creada roedd y gair gira diw, a diw oedd y gair. Notice diw, right? So the rest of that, other than and diw, I don't think we have any more Latin there, right? But diw, deum, deus, diw, dios, diw, right? So all those words, diw, or let me see, let me get the Welsh. Diw is the pronunciation there. Diw, gira, diw, right? Dios in Spanish, Dieu in French, Deus in Latin, right? So you can see that even in a language as different from Latin as Welsh, there's still Latin in it, right? The Romans went to Britain, the Romans conquered Britain, and the Romans had forts right there in Wales, right? So if you learn Latin, then you have an open door into familiarity with many, many, many other languages, including English, right? Because there are so many words in English that come from Latin. So the study of Latin is highly valuable, and for people who are accustomed to reading the Gospels in the New Testament, I especially advocate learning Latin via the reading of the Gospels in Latin. That's just a great way to accomplish a number of things. You're becoming more familiar with the Gospels, you're picking up Latin in the process, and in the process of learning Latin, you're learning the origins of many, many words.